Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Adam Benforado, who is a professor of law at Drexel University and also the author of a couple of books. Most recent book is called A Minor Revolution: How Prioritizing Kids Benefits Us All. And the other book, which I have over here on the Kindle version, is Unfair: The New Science of Criminal Injustice. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I thought maybe we'd start off with the book Unfair. It's been out for a long time, but I thought it was it made a lot of important points. One of which is that we in the legal community fail to appreciate the cognitive biases and heuristics that impact the lawmakers, the adjudicators, the lawyers, the people in the actual legal system. And, I remember when I was in law school, I was wondering what was it about psychology? Like, why hadn't it entered into the discipline? And then, of course, we had this huge movement, the kind of behavioral law and economics movement, which tried to bake in some understanding of human frailty and reasoning and so forth with respect to actors, right? Actors in the world, the ones that are affected by the law, the people we're trying to influence with the law, right? The people who are who need incentives to do things right and so forth. But that movement didn't really turn a lens on the legal machinery itself, right? And take a careful look at how those actors were influenced by things that might not be so conscious. So I guess one question is, what is it about lawyers and judges that leads them to think that they are so much more reasonable than regular people? And how is it that they're able to sustain that? I mean, to some degree they are, right? Obviously, that's what we learn, but they're not nearly as reasonable as they think they are.
Yeah. So, I think I might have had a similar experience to you, going out to law school. If you come from sort of a background where you've had exposure to science and particularly the behavioral sciences, and then you go to law school, it can be a kind of jarring experience. For me, I had taken, I really fully embraced the broad liberal arts education, and I learned all of this psychology and neuroscience and all this stuff and history and sociology. And I got to law school and it was kind of like, forget all that stuff. Like
Right.
it was kind of the heyday of the neoclassical law and economics movement. And so it was like, assume a rational actor in the contractual setting who has, perfect information, equal bargaining power and all this stuff. And in criminal law, it was kind of like assume a rational criminal who knows about the sentencing guidelines and has the ability to like make free choices and all this kind of stuff. And so I found that experience incredibly disillusioning. In fact, I almost was like, I shouldn't be at law school. This is the wrong place because everyone seems really comfortable with these starting assumptions. And luckily, I found a fellow skeptic on the Harvard Law School faculty, this guy, John Hanson, who, had been trained as a neoclassical economist and was starting to have deep doubts. And he started this project on law and mind sciences. And so when I was in law school, I suddenly was like, hey, this seems to be this huge problem with the legal system, that it's based largely around untested myths about human behavior. And I thought, well, this is not only sort of a necessary set of reforms for the criminal justice system, reorientation, but maybe this can be a career for me also as part of that process. And getting back to kind of your question, like, why is the law sort of more, or has been sort of more impervious to these changes? In terms of bringing in the behavioral sciences, I think the answer is really the backward orientation of the law. Its legitimacy, in a lot of ways comes from looking backward in time, which seems really different than a lot of other disciplines like, science, which is very much about, testing and looking forward and trying to find problems. I think, business, in many ways, used to be based on sort of the gut instincts of the CEO. But that, too, I think, is very much forward look. It's about, we got to do the marketing research. We got to anticipate where trends are going and things. And it's really weird, I think it feels so right for us in law to say, well, to answer this question, let's look back 250 years. Even a contract textbook has cases that took place in England. My students are sometimes mystified, like, why is there an English case in this book? And that's just intuitive. It's like we need the wisdom of the ages. Whereas if you went to the doctor and you got a bad diagnosis and your doctor was like, okay, to treat your cancer, let me get this dusty tome off the wall and read about leeches and purging, you would be like, Doc, no, I want you to go to the latest medical. I want the cutting edge, the stuff that's actually in trials right now. And I think that we need really that same sort of ability to unsettle the wagon a little bit and say, hey, which of these kind of underlying assumptions in law is based on fact and which is based in myth? Unfortunately, I think a lot of our legal system is still based on sort of that sandy foundation, which does not serve us well.
Well, I mean, I think the founders had this idea that the people that we elected would, in some ways, be insulated from the passions of the mob, right?
Yeah.
And that they would be able to reflect and, maybe consult with some experts, and the laws that they would draft would reflect more deliberation than you would get if you just opened the thing up, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we set
And
it up, the justice
yeah,
system as sort of this counter-majoritarian force that would be in the hands. I mean, think about how weird it is. We still let judges wear like robes and have gilded portraits of themselves, in the courtroom and sitting up on high. And I think that comes from this idea that these individuals, these stewards of law, are somehow more sort of better angels than us. And I think that unfortunately, that's reinforced in sort of narratives where we kind of assume that judges are umpires who can just call balls and strikes. And we think that sort of disclosing gifts is enough of a check, like that once we have that, once we know about the presents that they got at Christmas, like, and we ensure that maybe their husband is not presenting the case before them, that's enough, and we've handled bias. And unfortunately, I think the social science that we've accumulated literally over decades now tells a very different story, which is that judges are human beings like all the rest of us. And so we need to be just as aware of potential biases that are coming into their judgments and decision making as everyone else.
yeah, and of course, we sometimes think that even if jurors are biased in some way, the process of deliberation, right, in the jury room is going to somehow iron out those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a crazy thing. Anyone who's listening who's been to jury service lately probably has a similar experience. Now, I will tell you, I always get kicked off. No one wants the criminal law
Right.
professor on the jury, and I think especially when you write a book that has both the words unfair and injustice in the 7-word title, most prosecutors are not gonna want that either. But the
Well, wait, is it prosecutors that typically get rid of the law
it,
professors, or is it
it can
defense
be
attorneys
either.
that run
It
free?
can be either. Depends on which way you sense that someone is leading. But I've always tried to get on juries, and I have never gotten through.
Do they
And
check your written record before they to see
They
what you're?
they do. Well, they ask questions about, is there any reason? So the last time in jury service, there's any reason that you cannot be fair in this trial. Again, we treat it as if there's this switch inside of each juror's brain that they can just sort of flip on or off, that biases are subject to introspection and control. And so on that question, I remember the last time, I think it was maybe at the beginning of this year, I actually said, and I wrote a little note which said, I don't think I'm any more unfair than anyone else, but I should disclose to you that I did write a book called Unfair about biases, and that was enough. I was not impaneled on that jury. But going back to kind of, this idea of sort of how we reinforce these ideas, normally, even if you check a box, on the initial jury questionnaire on something like, it's more likely that I won't believe or I will believe a police officer simply because they're a police officer. How judges control for that generally when someone checks that is just to then tell the entire jury, hey, everyone, we understand we all come in with, certain preconceived beliefs, but when you step into the courtroom, you need to turn all that stuff off. Do you now that I've explained what being objective is, can you do that? When I've been on, sitting in the room like the jurors say yes, and then we just proceed. And I think, again, what the research kind of says is that we don't have the ability to flip on and off things that either are inherent in being a human being, or are the result of, the exposures that we've had for an entire lifetime. On that question of like believing or not believing a police officer. I live in Philadelphia. If you have grown up in certain areas of Philadelphia and interacted with the police your entire life, you are going to have inherent beliefs about police. If you live in, right, like maybe that police family in South Philly, like you are going to think police are good people that you can trust because that's like your family. If you live in maybe far west Philadelphia and you've had bad experiences and your uncles and your dad and your mom have all had bad experiences and believe the cops lie, the jury instruction in that moment isn't going to do the work. And unfortunately, I tend to think that the fact that we treat this as enough actually has a particularly negative effect because then it's like we don't have to worry about it anymore. We asked at the beginning, and so therefore any results must be fair. And I think that is really belied whether you look right at wrongful convictions or you look at disparate racial impacts or anything you want to look at. We are not kind of these objective, dispassionate actors when it comes to criminal law or any kind of legal outcomes.
Well, let's talk about criminal law for a second. I mean, the United States seems to be an outlier in the developed world with respect to not only its level of criminality, violence, but also the punitive nature of its criminal legal system. I mean, is this just a function of our culture and the way in which we have cultivated individualism and so forth? Or are these in some ways causal? In other words, is there a role that the criminal legal system plays in causing this high level of violence and criminality?
So I think it's probably both. One thing that I would point out is really there's also this disjunction between public perceptions and realities, right? So in some ways in the history of the world, right, we're living at like the safest, least criminal moment. And certainly even in, my lifetime, I was born in 1979. If you look at the difference between, crime rates in the 1970s versus today, it's really a radical drop. Now we had this blip.
Or even in the 1990s.
Yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
like we were just saying, like when I lived in Philadelphia, I
Right.
mean, it was a little bit more dangerous than it is now.
Huge. And so I think, it is important starting out first to note the disjunction between public perceptions, which is like we're living in a very dangerous situation, and, Philadelphia, dangerous hellhole, as opposed to really nice place where I currently live with my kids. And I think then, we sort of think about sort of the causal story about nonetheless, we do have crime and what causes it. I think you've put your finger on some good potential explanations. One of them is the idea that actually incarceration breeds crime. I think there's a lot of reason to think that's true. Certainly, another area which we'll probably talk about later on the podcast is sort of my children's rights work. And I think there's a really upsetting story about kind of the school to prison pipeline, where kind of children who are, early teens, who are acting out get suspended, the police get called for in-school behavior, and that leads them into, the juvenile system and then the adult system. And I think that's really creating criminals. I think if we took a different approach, we would not create criminals. So I think there is this story that the incarceration heavy method breeds criminality. Now, I think there's another story, which you mentioned the word individualism in our culture, which I also think has led us to embrace mass incarceration in a way that really nowhere else in the world has done. I think one of the reasons that we are an outlier is that it is part of our national identity and in some ways national myth, the idea of the individual making free choices, making his way out on the frontier. And that notion, again, which is very familiar from neoclassical economics, kind of dictates that those who succeed should be patted on the back and celebrated, and those who fail have only themselves to blame for making bad choices. And you can see how in a culture where it all comes down to the individual, everyone can make good or bad decisions and should be held accountable for those decisions, how that would lead to an embrace of, sort of very punitive measures. Whereas in other cultures where, after some crime, the focus is really on the failures of the family or the failures of the community or the failures of the culture, that would lead to not punishing and blaming that individual, but rather to making societal changes. And I think this is really a division, even within, sort of cultures in the West. There's a sharper division between, I think, Eastern cultures and Western cultures on this sort of dispositionism, which results in different sort of punitive approaches. But I think even within the West, if you go to countries like Sweden and Norway and Germany, the ideas of individualism are less. It's much more of a communitarian society in which things like poverty are not seen as individual failings. And so they have more of a social safety net. Here, we're consistent. We both don't help poor people. We blame them for being poor, and we blame criminals for crime. And again, that might seem like a really radical thing to some listeners. Like, of course, criminals are to blame. This crazy professor suggesting something otherwise. But I think, again, that's because of our preconceived notions. And I think there's a really different way to look at crime, which is that everything is situational. It's a result of genes and environment. And of course, society can play around with those things and make crime go up or go down. And so, I think in this book, one of my hopes with doing it was honestly to provoke people to try to think about things that they think they know so well. And crime is one thing we think we know so well in our lives. But I think here we have to understand different countries, different people over time have taken very different approaches. And it is not that somehow, people living in these cultures are fundamentally different than us. I've been to these other countries, and I would say humans actually are surprisingly similar. And what's different, though, in our country is how we approach it.
But I mean, even within the individual agency model, right, you can have a judicial system which is rehabilitative versus one that is punitive. And it does seem like there was a time in our past. I mean, you mentioned Eastern State Penitentiary. I mean, I think that the stated goal of that was rehabilitation. And it doesn't seem like rehabilitation is the main focus of our penal system today.
It isn't. And, I think that is partially that we're all taught that criminals are bad and different and separate from us, and that, we have nothing to do with them, and that they're most of them are irredeemable. And so it's just a waste of money and resources. And it's unfair. I think one of the things that's held out, actually, there's a connection between the social safety net and the incarceration story is I often hear it is like, well, wait a second, like a college program for incarcerated young men, right? There are a lot of people who haven't committed crimes who are not, can't afford to go to college. My response there is, well, if in fact we think that education is a good thing for society and a more educated workforce and more employment is good for our society, we probably should invest in both of those things. It's not an either or. But I think oftentimes our lack of, addressing homelessness is used as, well, I can't make better conditions for prisoners because they're homeless people. And my response is, well, if you think actually lack of stable housing is a problem, you should probably address that in your city and also think about the conditions of that individual. Now, one of the things I think people often don't think about when they are really sort of thinking about things through this retributive lens, like I want this person to suffer. They broke the law, they stole something, and I want them to suffer. And therefore, I'm comfortable with that person being locked in a 9x7 cell for 11 hours a day and not having access to talk to their family and not having any reading material or any way to improve themselves as an individual. Almost all of those individuals are going to get out, including people in solitary confinement. We don't lock up people forever. We lock them up for many years, but we release almost all of those people back into our communities. And again, this is an area where I actually find some common ground with folks across the political spectrum is, what do you think happens when you put someone who's already having problems, you cut them off from all of the good things in their life? Their mother, who loved them unconditionally and actually is trying to help the person's kids, the person's friends, don't give them any job training, surround them with other antisocial people, don't allow them to get out and in the sunshine. How do you think that person's going to behave? I mean, if you took a dog and you locked it in a room 23 hours a day and poked it with a stick, how do you think that dog is going to act? And then we act surprised, though, and we find the source of the reoffending in the individual. Oh, this is just proof that it was disposition all along. When it's no, actually, you took someone, young men, most of the time 18 to 25, living in areas where they got into trouble, and then you put them with everyone else who got into trouble in that same age bracket in a box, and you shake up the box. What do you think is going to happen? It's going to cost you a lot of money, and you're going to pay those tens of thousands of dollars each year, and you're going to pay when they get out, when they don't have a job, when they don't have family connections, when they don't have housing, when they get into problems with substance abuse.
Now, look, even if you believe in this retributive model, right, it's hard to justify the collateral effects, right? So when you lock someone up, there is a big impact on their children, right, who then have to grow up in a broken household. So, I mean, how do people reconcile that? I mean, do they just assume that this criminal must have been a bad parent anyway, so they weren't, adding any value to the household, and so their removal will probably not have any impact? Or is it sort of a, super Old Testament view that the fruit of the tree, is poisoned anyway, and so who cares? I mean, why don't we factor in the spillover effects of the punishment?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of it is that we don't think about kids. So opening a couple days of criminal law, when I teach the big survey course in law school, we talk about the presumption of innocence and the importance of making sure that no innocent people ever go to prison. It's like one of the core tenets of our legal system. And so then I point out, to my students, wait a second, but what about all of the kids? When primary caregivers of young children get locked up in our jails, pretrial, or prison, and they think, I didn't even think about those people. I didn't even think of it. And that's partially because our legal system keeps the kids away They're not part of trial. And it used to be formally, right? It used to be, right, before certain changes in the law, right? They couldn't be considered. The fact that someone has 3 young children could not be taken into account at sentencing, was seen as unfair. And again, I think that's crazy, right? If one of the goals of our criminal justice system is to reduce crime at cheapest cost, when you take away a single mother or a father, what happens to those kids? They go into the foster care system. How does the foster care system work? And it does not work well. Those kids are more likely, right, to face sexual abuse. They're more likely to have substance abuse problems. They're more likely to be arrested and follow the same path. And so this is an intergenerational harm, not simply to that family line, but to all of us, all that lost productivity and all of that cost. And so how do we possibly get here? I mean, I think part of it is biblical, right? The idea that the sins of the father, right, sort of are exacted on the children. I think there is a bigger part that really is just ignorance. We just don't focus on kids, and so often when we start talking about kids, what I find is people want to pivot back to the parents, right? It's like, well, yes, there's a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old who are going to go into the foster care system. And I've read some articles about yeah, I know how bad that is. And those kids are going to suffer. But mom should have thought about that. She's a bad mom. And, one of the things, my response is, okay, you and I can disagree about what caused this woman to decide to be a middleman in a drug transaction that has gotten her into this mess. We can disagree about that, but can we at least agree that these children are absolutely innocent? They're 3 years old and 6 years old. We do not want those kids to suffer from hunger. We do not want those kids to be sexually assaulted. We want them to grow up like all American children. And that has to be the most important thing. And sometimes you can't get everything you want. Well, if you had to choose, would you choose hurting the parent or helping the kid? And again, I think most people in America, when they have to choose, and when they actually, again, in writing A Minor Revolution, I talked to a lot of kids whose parents had been arrested and incarcerated. And when you hear an adult, a 20-something adult, crying on the phone about something that happened, going to visit their father and being told at age 7, you're too old, you can't sit on his lap anymore. This is the one visit you get per year. I think most Americans, feeling that and thinking about the child, reach a different conclusion about our justice system. And the cool thing is you can hate kids. You can be the most callous, like fiscal conservative, and it's still in your interest to think about that kid. Because the system that we have right now is a pathway to bankruptcy and not addressing crime.
Well, I think that's how two books tie together.
Yeah.
Is this idea that, very rarely does someone decide to become a violent criminal in their 40s.
Right.
I mean, sometimes I guess people, get into crimes of passion and so forth. But most of these folks are going to set their course onto a criminal career while they're children. And if left to their own devices, those urges would probably subside, right? By the time they got older. I mean, it's mostly young males. And so why is it that we don't invest in making these children productive members of society? Is it that we don't really understand the ROI of these investments? Or is it that we know the ROI, but we just don't think that it's a spillover? We think that the main beneficiaries are those individuals rather than the rest of society.
I think it goes back a little bit to what we were talking about at the beginning, right? Sort of the orientation of the law. It's not simply that it's backwards looking. It's generally reactionary, right? So we wait for something bad to happen, and then we address it for the law, right? So we wait for the copyright to be violated. We wait for the crime to happen. We wait for the contract to be broken. We wait for the person to get sick as a result of consuming the and then the law kicks
Yeah.
in, right? And that's
So the laws
certainly
it's
how.
kind of like so it's kind of like the medical system, right?
Yeah, yeah, right.
Where
And I think, unfortunately,
we focus on remediation rather than
of
prevention.
symptoms, right? And I think that the medical system, right, has undergone, and still it's incomplete. But the idea of preventative medicine is, wow, it makes a lot more sense. And again, the data is very strong. If you can avoid problems in childhood, adolescence, health and nutritional problems, you save, it's pennies here or many dollars down the line with sort of ineffective end of life sort of interventions. And I think, again, we have a very similar story to tell with respect to the criminal law system. It makes so much more sense to invest in the prevention side. But unfortunately, once you've built the system as reactions, once the case books, I mean, it's really weird to think about in any area of law, the idea of the case book, right? Like it's appellate cases in most instances, right? So like the trial happened years ago. Here are judges weighing in and have very limited things that they can do. In business law, right, there's been a shift to, hey, we shouldn't teach like business. Why don't we talk about transactions like contract formation, the deal? This should be where our legal focus is, because if you can write a really good deal, you don't end up in court. You don't have those problems down the line. We need that same sort of thinking across the line, including in criminal law. I ask my students at the end of the course, like, can you imagine a criminal legal system, right, where the tools were not courts and judges and legal statutes listing crimes and sort of punishment recommendations on? What if the tools were preschools and early health interventions and neighborhood investments? Like, wouldn't that be a way more effective system? And the answer is yes. But it's very hard because most of my students, even when they get to that point after hearing me blather for, a lot, even when they agree, yes, the research does seem to support that, it's like, well, what do we do now? We take the bar, the people are the prosecutor's office, defender's office, adversarial system. Like, it's very hard to think about how you change the role, and even sort of the mechanisms for addressing injustice that we have built into the legal system, right? So like pro bono work is generally like, I go and represent someone for free who is in this, as opposed to what I do, and my responsibility as a lawyer is to actually change the broken system, not simply to help people who get beaten down as a result of a broken system, but to change the broken system. That's really hard, but it's really at the core of what I see my responsibility is. I don't think lawyers can do this work. I think it has to come from legal academia saying, hey, we have a special responsibility. We have the ability to actually ask these questions, to be skeptical. In a way, I think people in the system don't have that freedom. It's really hard to be a lawyer and say, hey, there's judicial bias. You have to appear before juries, and you have to appear before judges. And so I think it's on legal academics to sound the alarm and then to try to translate that work, that academic work, into real world change.
Well, one of the themes in the book Mind Revolution is kind of, when do we think of children as adults, right? And it seems like we attribute agency in a rather arbitrary way, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes, we hold relatively young people accountable for criminal actions, and then other times we don't give them the ability to drink alcohol or vote and so forth. So, I mean, what accounts for this confusing view of what constitutes a child?
I think it is sort of the fact that we kind of look at children in ways that are self-serving, right? So I think when we deny 22% of American citizens a right to choose who's president, right? That's in some ways self-serving for all of the rest of us, like 73 million Americans who actually have a lot of stake in the game and will actually live with the consequences of the next presidential election a lot more than, my 83-year-old father-in-law. When we deny them, when we say you don't have agency, you don't know enough about the world, or you don't have the capacity to vote, that's self-serving. That allows us to have more power. Now, on the flip side, when we decide that actually we want to send a 16-year-old off for the rest of life, effectively, with a criminal law sentence, that too feels sort of reassuring, like we've addressed the problem, rather than having to accept like that we live in a society or a city that does not support young men, and our schools are crumbling, and we haven't addressed racial problems, and we haven't, like, it may feel better just like he's a super predator, just throw him away, lock him up. Now that seems in many ways like an inconsistency. It seems inconsistent, right? To both sort of say, kids can't contract on their own, and also we want to lower the labor laws so that kids can work in, chicken factories because we don't have enough workers in our state. Yes, that seems inconsistent, but again, I think it's self-serving, and I think we can project whatever we want onto children, in part because they don't have any formal political power. So we get to say whatever we want about them, and the Supreme Court has backed, up school officers, and very, very much so parents.
Well, I mean, it's hard to make the case that we care less about children now than we did in previous eras, right? I mean,
Yeah, although I think it's really interesting. I think it's about who ought to have the responsibility to care. Like, that's the difference. And so if you look back at the early 20th century, we're coming out of the Industrial Revolution. We have an influx of immigrants into our big cities from Europe, and there are a lot of sort of progressives who are looking around saying, this is terrible. They're 11-year-olds rolling cigarettes in New York City factories. There are children who are emaciated on the streets. We need to do something about this, because ultimately, right, the condition of these children is a sort of preview of where society is going to head in 20 years. And so the state has both a right and responsibility to ensure good public education, to ensure, right, we get clean cow's milk, and we get rid of snake oil salesmen targeting, giving opium medications to infants, and we invest in playgrounds, and we pass child labor laws. And I think what's really fascinating is that there was a backlash to this, right? There was a backlash from business interests who said the same things that they say now, which is you're interfering in sort of the economic power of parents. And there was sort of a parents' rights movement that was tied to this, which said, I don't want the state, right, mandating education. Parents ought to be the deciders. And so over the course of the 20th century, you have these really important Supreme Court cases which sort of reify this idea that parents are the deciders of education, medical care, family relationships. And that comes, I think, to the present day, where, we have a robust parents' rights movement that locates all decisions relating to kids with parents. And the ironic thing about this is it's pitched as this is really good for parents, right? So there's right now in Congress bills been introduced to amend the Constitution to create a children's or a parents' rights amendment to the Constitution, and this is pitched as like this really good thing for parents. Finally, be empowered. My response is that's already happened, right? Parents already are the decider. This is the Supreme Court in every state. This is the rule. Parents have the power. What this really is a declaration that the state is not going to help parents. It is incredibly exhausting these days. I have a 7-year-old and an 11-year-old, And it's all on our shoulders. Post COVID, right? We have to make all the decisions, what vaccine schedules to follow, when to teach about slavery, when to have sex education talks. We have to do all of these extracurricular activities so that our kids are college ready and hire tutors. And it's one of the reasons that American parents are so much less happy than parents in every other area of the world, including those that where parents have way less money. Because it's all on us. Sink or swim, it's all on you. If your child does well, great, pat on the back. But your child has problems, that's because you were a bad parent. And so to me, when I advocate for children's rights, I say this is the best thing you can imagine, parents. This will make your life better because the thing you care the most about, and all the parents, is their children's welfare. And so when we think about things like, right, care leave, medical insurance for children, safe schools, good schools, these are all things that are child focused, but are ultimately take a huge burden and set of worries off of parents' shoulders.
But aren't there some legitimate concerns there? I mean, throughout history, there have been cases where people who are out groups or disfavored or disadvantaged have had their children taken away, had their cultures destroyed by overreaching governments and so forth. I mean, isn't there a concern that the society might have a particular view of how children should be raised, and they want to impose it on people?
There absolutely is. But of course, we run that risk when we have parents also, right? So, like, it can be that parents are like the saviors of their children's freedoms and allow them to experience their culture. Or parents can decide, I'm not going to allow those things. I'm not going to allow my kid any access to the culture from which they're from, or deny them all education or whatever those things are. And so I think it's about trade-offs and where do you end up with sort of the better balance. Now, we are in the United States really an outlier, right? We're the only UN member state not to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child, this UN treaty groundbreaking from 1989, which provides sort of protective rights, investment rights, and even empowerment rights, right? A right to a child to be heard in legal processes that involve them. And personally, I think a child is much safer under that regime. Now, if you look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, parents are front and center, right? I think there's an understanding among all child advocates that parents are, in most cases, the most important people in the lives of children and the most important stewards of their children's potential. I think that again, in a culture where there's help from the government, I think children are less at risk. Now, is there always in any sort of social ordering you might decide the opportunity for adults to use their own sort of interests while talking about, the best interests of the child? Absolutely. I think one of the big checks on that, though, is seeking ways to formally empower children so that they can be a check on all of the adults, whether that's government adults, whether that's at a sort of more local level. I think when children have a real voice in society, they can help tell us when this is really in children's interests and when it's actually surface in children's interests, but not actually.
Well, I mean, is there a deep inconsistency between the views of elite parents with respect to how much attention their kids need and their belief about how these bad kids turn out, right? I mean, in other words, it seems like if you're an elite parent, you believe that everything you do is going to have an impact, right? You got to play Mozart to your kid when they're 2 years old, and you've got to like micromanage their play schedule and so forth, because you think that if you don't do this, your kid's going to turn out poorly. But that seems inconsistent with the view that these bad kids turn out to be bad just because they're bad, right? I mean, is it just a suppression of that insight,
I think
refusal
it's
to
a I think
acknowledge
it's
it?
a I think it's a great point. I think yes, it is inconsistent. I think we tend to not notice all of sort of the nudges that wealthy, more affluent parents gives their children in the right direction, right? So like there a few years back, right, with the college scandal, right? That's the perception of like if you create hire someone to take the SATs for your kid and create a false profile that they're an equestrian so that they get like the truth of the matter is, like, that's a tiny drop in the bucket. Like, what really matters are all of the other things that affluent parents do all of the time without even thinking about it as being an advantage. But what we know, right, we promise socioeconomic mobility. But if you look at it, right, if you're in that bottom quintile of family income versus that top quintile of family income, in many ways your trajectory, no matter how inherently smart you are at third grade, a lot of that's already tracked out simply based on all of that investment that wealthy parents are going to make over the course of that young person's childhood. And that's both positive enrichment, but it's also when a lot of kids get into trouble. Something doesn't work. They're struggling in math, or they hit a kid in school, or they get sick. What happens, right? If you have wealthy parents, those problems get addressed and you get many second chances. If you're a poor kid, you don't. And again, I think this is an area where, right, we try to address this by saying, well, each parent is on their own. And I think this is a left right thing. I think it's certainly the parents' rights movement is more associated with the Republican Party right now. But I think on, the left, I think, sort of folks like Emily Oster, who are sort of giving advice to worried parents, are kind of selling the same thing that it's all on you to make good decisions, to on your own, figure out what sleep method is best. Figure out on your own, like, how are you going to protect your kids against ticks? Figure out on your own, right, whether to send your kid to sleepaway camp. And the truth is, the biggest things that matter the most to kids are the big societal interventions for poor kids. Kids from wealthy families already have all of this support, whether that's medical care that they need, whether that's educational support, they tend to get it. The things that matter the most in terms of our nation and the future of our nation, not simply the economic present, but the decades ahead, are those big societal investments that we might make. But I think on the left and right, we're selling, no, it's down to individual parents. And that's really going to hurt that bottom quintile by family income.
Well, look, this book, Mind Revolution, it was not a book about parenting, but there is a lot of stuff in there about parenting. And I think there are some connections between the beliefs that parents have about their kids and how it translates into the criminal law, right? In other words, in terms of the kind of risks that people think their children face, like things like, I don't know, the likelihood that they're going to be in accidents, the likelihood that they're going to be victims of crime, the likelihood that they're going to be, sexually molested or something like this. I mean, that seems to drive how you raise your kids. It also seems to drive how punitive you want to be with respect to various punishments and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that is disturbing, honestly, and really hard as a parent is you're faced with all of these things that you might worry about, which are stoked. I mean, don't read when you're a new parent. Do not read the newspaper, and certainly when something happens to your kid, do not Google, right? Like rash, fever, because
Right.
you go in, and it's just there are so many bad things that can happen and so many horror stories. And you start to think the world is the most dangerous place. And I've got to wrap my kid in bubble wrap And any step I make is dangerous. And so the best case scenario is me being there. I should be by my child's side. Everything should be an organized activity so that I can monitor and assess the risks. And I should read up on all this stuff and optimize all these things and solve problems. If my child starts to have a bad social, I should solve that. And the unfortunate thing is, right? Like, this is not good for kids. Kids need space for independent play. They need space to make mistakes. They need space actually to get hurt and learn that it's okay. The pain fades. You can pick yourself up. You can get in an argument with your best friend and figure it out without mom coming in and setting up sort of a negotiation with other parent. Let's get them on the Zoom call and we can work it out and make it like, that's not good for kids. They never develop the independence and autonomy. And what's really, drives me crazy is to then see parents and rest of society blame young people for not showing upon age 19 enough independence and ability to solve problems on their own and creativity and all of these things. And I'm like, but you created the conditions. You didn't give kids what they needed. So I really advocate for sort of evidence-based assessment of risk. And I actually think, to a little plug for people like Emily Oster, I think actually that's an area where she's really good, is kind of figuring out what are real risks and what are things we don't need to worry about. You don't need to worry about your kid eating country mud. Do you need, if you live in Northeast Philadelphia and your kid is playing in dust where there used to be a lead smelting plant? Yes. That's hard, right? Sorting out, you think dirt is dirt. Dirt is not dirt. And that's where I think we need the experts to help us actually assess what are the real things we should worry about and aren't worrying about enough. And what are the things that actually we can relax about? For example, letting your kid walk to school, letting your kid go and play with friends unaccompanied, letting your kid jump off the top of the playground equipment. Those are all things, again, make me kind of cringe as a parent of young kids. And I have to force myself to say, actually, I can do it. I can let my kid experience the world on their own. And also, though, making sure that they don't make the metaphorical jumps that really put them in real peril. That's hard, but I think that's where social scientists and experts can be really helpful. And unfortunately, we're living in a time where there's a real mistrust. We're all told, like, experts get it wrong too much, just trust your instincts as a parent. That I don't like, because I think that it leads to endless anxiety for parents and some suboptimal decision making.
Well, it seems like we are dividing the country into children that are underparented and under-resourced, and ones that are overparented and over-resourced, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. And so how do we find a way back? I mean, I think, again, parents I'm a parent. I think parents are great. And I think parents are essential. I spend a huge amount of time with my kids. I'm coaching both of their basketball teams starting on Saturday. Like, parents are key to all of this. But I think one of the ways to address the concern you raise is to have more of a role for the state, for the kids who don't have parents who are there, either don't have parents in their lives, don't have parents who have jobs that they can help with. I think that's a way for, right, when we create better, just to keep the example going, right, basketball leagues, sports leagues in cities, opportunities after school for all children. That's a great use of state resources, and that helps all kids. That relieves parents who maybe are like a little fearful of their, not maximizing the kid, but it helps kids who don't have parents who are looking out for them too.
Well, look, last question. In the book, Unfair, you start off by looking back at the legal system of the Middle Ages, right? And trial by ordeal, and you speculated that at some point in the future they're going to look back at our judicial system and think similar thoughts, right? And you have lots of great examples to support that idea. But for me, it seems like a matter of investment, right? It seems like if you really want to make sure that you're identifying the guilty people and the innocent people and so forth, I mean, this is just a matter of resources, right? And it seems like we intentionally underinvest in the court system and the adjudication system and try to push everything towards pleas, right? And most of the trials wind up with a plea bargain. I mean, why don't we consider the truth revealed by a good trial to be a good investment? I mean, we see this not just in criminal trials. We see it, for instance, in asylum hearings and other situations where we have a judge involved or a jury involved. It seems like, we just want to get it over with, right?
Yeah.
We might as well be rolling dice in some of these things, it seems.
Yeah. So, I think it's a great question. There's a how we got to this point. It's kind of a funny story because in one way, right, we in our Constitution and in sort of case law over many decades and centuries, we kind of have enshrined the idea of trial rights and all of these procedural hoops that have to be followed. And then in 9 out of 10 cases, we don't have a trial. None of those constitutional rights are even implicated.
Well, I mean, are trials too expensive and too...
So the answer is, unfortunately, granting all of these procedural protections and using this adversarial system, we've created all of this weight and time that uses up a huge amount of resources. We have to have an hearing about, right, whether this particular evidence was seized as a result of a Fourth Amendment violation. We have to have, filings and court dates and all of this kind of stuff. We simply cannot provide it. And so as a result, when I talk to prosecutors, I sometimes ask them like, hey, the plea bargain system really seems antithetical to some of our justice and fairness values. What's the best argument in favor of it? And it's we don't have the resources. That's the best argument that I've ever heard, is simply we don't have the resources to do that. And to me, that's not good enough, right? If we really think that the process is important, if we really think that the truth is important, one of the things that I think people don't realize is with plea bargains, we never learn the real truth. Someone might plead out to second-degree murder. We don't know what happened. They could be innocent. They could be guilty of first-degree murder. We never have the trial. We never hear from the witnesses. There's no oversight. And so I think this is, a moment where we really have to look at our true values. What do we really care about as a society? Is it efficiency? Is it locking people up? Or is it truth, accuracy, fairness? If it's those things, we have to make very different decisions. And again, I want my law students to think about this in law school. And I certainly want members of the public to think about it, because unfortunately, I think once you're in the system, once you're a lawyer, you have so much work. If you're a public defender, if you're a prosecutor, you have so much to do every day. You don't have time to question, I think, the very origins of the system or the merits of our approach. And I think that's on not simply law students, but all of us to really think about what is it that we care about, and is the system that we are delivering really following through on those values?
Well, Adam, thank you so much for joining me. We've got a couple great books here. The one called Unfair from a few years back about our judicial system. And also this one, A Minor Revolution, How Prioritizing Kids Benefits Us All. Thanks so much for joining.
It was a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.